The meeting was already behind schedule, the air in the boardroom stiff with tension and too much cologne. 46th floor, sharp suits. Digital projections beaming onto glass walls no one actually looked through anymore, and Morgan Ellis halfway through a sentence that was supposed to close a merger 3/4 in the making. And then the door opened. Not a dramatic swing, not a knock, just the quiet scrape of hinges followed by a voice that didn't belong there, didn't belong anywhere near that room, that floor, that world. "Excuse me. My dad's sick today, so I came instead." The sentence landed like a loose wire in water, silent, then electric. For a second no one moved, and Morgan, who hadn't missed a beat in 14 years, stopped cold. She turned slowly toward the sound, expecting security, and in turn with a panicked face. Maybe someone from facilities who'd gotten lost. But what she saw was a kid. A boy, 7, maybe 8, wearing a janitor's uniform 4 sizes too big, the sleeves folded twice, the pant legs cinched with shoelaces, holding a small spray bottle and a blue cloth like they were a badge and a sword. His hair was wind mussed and his sneakers didn't match, one red, one gray, and he looked right at her, steady, without apology. "I'm Noah Becker," he added, his voice a little too practiced, like someone had made him rehearse it in front of a bathroom mirror. "My dad's name is Eric. He's the one who cleans up here before you all come in. But he couldn't today. He's really sick. So I thought, maybe I could do it instead." Nobody laughed. Nobody spoke. The VP of Finance lowered her coffee cup so slowly it didn't make a sound when it hit the table. The room had shifted. Not loud, not obvious, but the shift was real. Morgan didn't speak, didn't blink, just stared at the boy like he'd somehow cracked the algorithm to get inside the one space in the building no one got into without clearance, badges, layers of scheduling, and gatekeeping. The boy took one hesitant step forward. "He says the big desk is the most important. That's where the important people sit. So it should be the cleanest." His voice didn't waver, and for a second, Morgan wasn't looking at a child anymore, but someone carrying weight well beyond his years. She hated the way it hit her, hated that she felt something about it, something foreign and unwelcome and entirely out of step with the morning's goals. She cleared her throat, gently placed her tablet on the glass table, and stepped away from the board. "Come with me," she said, not asking. She didn't wait for approval or explain herself to the room. Morgan Ellis didn't explain. She walked, and the boy followed, squeaky sneakers echoing between marble and glass, past framed awards and motion-detecting lights, toward her corner office with the skyline view and the kind of desk that didn't look like it had ever been touched by human hands. Once inside, she turned to face him. "You shouldn't be here." He looked up, eyes calm. "I know." He pulled the cloth from his pocket, the spray bottle already uncapped. "But I thought if I didn't show up, someone might think he was lazy, or didn't care. But he does. Every day, even when he's tired. Especially then." He walked toward the desk, set the bottle down like it was fragile, and squirted a single spray into his palm. Then, with small circular movements, he began to wipe. Morgan watched, arms folded, silence thick between them. She had hosted prime ministers in this room, closed billion-dollar deals, walked out of one mediation and straight into another without pausing to exhale. But now she stood, still, as a child cleaned her desk like it meant something, like it was sacred, like it mattered. "Why does your dad clean?" she asked, not sure where the question even came from. Noah shrugged, focused. "He says it's honest, that it helps us have lights, and cereal, and socks that don't have holes in them." Morgan swallowed something dry. She hadn't cried since her 20s, hadn't had the time, hadn't given herself the permission. "And you? Why are you really here?" she asked, the question softer than she intended. Noah looked up, his expression unreadable. "Because he told me we don't quit on the people we show up for." Morgan exhaled, the first real breath of her day, maybe of her week. Something in that sentence, simple, unpolished, slid past the wall she'd built and settled somewhere behind her ribs. The boy finished the desk, then looked around. "You keep it really clean. Just a few fingerprints. 1 from a mug, and 2 from where you rest your hands." She looked down and saw them barely, their smudges revealed in the morning light, like ghosts of a daily routine she'd never thought twice about. He noticed. He cleaned them. And just as he stepped back, just as she almost said thank you, the cup her ceramic water glass tipped. It hit the edge and rolled, crashing to the floor, water splashing across the surface toward a folder of signed international contracts. Noah froze. His eyes widened in horror, hands twitching like he wanted to fix it but didn't know how. I'm sorry. Please, don't fire him. I didn't mean to dash, but Morgan was already moving. She grabbed a stack of napkins, blocked the water, scooped the folder, and caught the papers before the ink bled. She crouched, and when she looked up, the boy's eyes were glassy. I messed it up, he whispered. I was just trying to help. Morgan handed him a napkin. You didn't mess it up. You showed up. That's more than most people twice your age do. Noah blinked, unsure. My dad says cleaning helps people breathe better. She looked down at the now spotless desk, then at the boy in front of her. And for the first time in a long time, she believed it. Morgan hadn't planned to cancel her day for a child with mismatched shoes and a spray bottle, but somehow the silence after he left lingered louder than the conference call she was supposed to be on. Her tablet buzzed twice with reminders she ignored. Emails slid in like missiles, and someone from PR had already flagged a blurry hallway photo of the kid entering the boardroom captioned vaguely, encircling the internal comms like a spark in dry leaves. She should have shut it down immediately, cut the cord, reasserted her grip on the daily machine that churned profit from silence, but she didn't. Instead, she sat at her desk staring at the faint trace of lemon cleaner in the air and thought about what he said. You don't quit on the people you show up for. It was the kind of sentence Morgan typically dismissed too sentimental, too simple, but this one stuck. Because she knew what it was like to be shown up for by no one. Years ago, before the skyline views and the seven-figure decisions, she'd faced a hospital waiting room alone with a result she never spoke of again. No shoulder, no voice saying stay. Just her, a clipboard, and a choice. She had made it, moved forward, never looked back. Until now. Downstairs, whispers were gaining velocity. The receptionist had already heard 3 versions of the story, each more dramatic than the last. A child storming the boardroom, the CEO crying at her desk, a janitor's son cleaning his way into a job offer. None of it true, all of it echoing. Even the head of facilities had caught wind and sent a situation report to legal, asking if the building's liability insurance covered underage labor. Morgan scrolled through it blankly, thumb hovering over delete, and stopped only when she saw Noah's name typed in an awkward font, attached to a sentence that began with unknown intentions. That was when she stood. That was when she walked to the elevator, descended 17 floors, and entered the maintenance wing for the first time since the building had opened. It smelled like oil and time, the kind of place that never made it into brochures but held up everything above it. When she pushed open the door marked custodial supplies, every conversation in the hallway stopped mid-sentence. Eric Becker was sitting on an overturned crate, head in his hands, breathing like it hurt. He looked up when she entered, clearly not expecting her or anyone in his space. His face was pale, hair still damp from what looked like a cold shower taken with the last bit of hot water he could find. She didn't speak, just stood there, watching the man who had quietly kept her floors clean for 3 years without ever asking for anything more than functioning dispensers and a replacement vacuum. I didn't know he went, he said finally, voice raw. I woke up and the note was on the counter. Said he didn't want me to lose the job. Morgan nodded once. He didn't lose it, she said. Eric blinked. I'll talk to him. Make sure he knows Dash, but she cut him off with a raised hand. He cleaned my desk better than my own team cleans their data sets. It wasn't a compliment. It was something else. Recognition, maybe. Or all. She didn't add that the kid had also reminded her what it meant to feel something in a room where feelings were usually filtered out like background noise. Later that day, Morgan was still thinking about the boy when she passed the glass stairwell and caught sight of 2 associates watching a phone screen together. They snapped to attention when she approached, but the screen had already told the truth. A grainy video of Noah wiping her desk, his small body framed against a skyline built by men who never got their hands dirty. She should have confiscated it. Should have addressed the breach, the footage, the potential narrative risk, as her VP of comms would later call it. But instead, Morgan kept walking, her reflection stretching across the glass beside her. Something inside had cracked open, and though she didn't know what to call it yet, it wasn't going to close easily. Not now. And certainly not after what happened the next morning, because the video didn't stay internal. By sunrise, it had been reposted, reshared, reframed. And suddenly, the boy who just wanted to help was the janitor's son trending on social media. Only one person seemed unaware of it all: Noah himself, who at that very moment was sitting cross-legged in a public library with a second-hand backpack and a banana in his pocket, completely focused on a children's book about stars, completely unaware that he had just become the spark to something far bigger than himself. By the time Morgan arrived at the office that morning, the building already felt different. Not visibly, no one had rearranged the furniture or installed a tribute wall, but in the way people held their voices a little lower, glanced up from their desks a little more often, paused before speaking like they were suddenly aware that something sacred had passed through the halls. The night team had been the first to hear, then the interns, then someone in legal who leaked the footage to a friend for context. The clip had gone from internal Slack thread to viral in less than 8 hours, morphing into a symbol of integrity none of them had earned. The media hadn't named Morgan yet, but the captions didn't need to. A janitor's kid walks into the top floor and teaches a skyscraper how to feel, one tweet read. Another, this is what leadership should look like, 7 years old and showing more backbone than the suits in the room. Morgan didn't flinch at the attention. She flinched at how little it took to shake the building. A child with a rag, a spilled cup, a sentence about showing up. That's all it had taken to uncover the fact that maybe, just maybe, no one really liked what they saw in the mirror before this week. She avoided her own reflection that day, not because of shame, but because of clarity. And clarity was dangerous when you'd built your name on cold control. The offers had already started rolling in: press junkets, interviews, invitations to speak on empathy in leadership, like she was a brand now, not a woman still trying to understand why a child's presence had shifted her more than any billion-dollar pivot ever had. She ignored them all. She kept to herself, except when she didn't, because later that afternoon, she found herself walking past the service entrance to the maintenance wing again, slowing down as if pulled by something that couldn't be named. She didn't go inside. Not yet. But she saw Eric again, this time upright, mop in hand, wiping the base of a glass divider no one noticed unless it was dirty. He looked up. She nodded once. It wasn't a conversation. It was something older. Recognition between two people who'd spent their lives hiding in different kinds of armor, one in bleach and silence, the other in spreadsheets and high rises. For a moment, neither of them needed to speak to understand they were now part of the same story. Not because they wanted to be, but because life doesn't ask permission before it connects the broken parts of strangers. That evening, Morgan stayed late. Not out of duty, not to catch up on anything urgent, but because she couldn't bear to leave the building while the feeling still hung in the air. She made her way to the executive lounge, brewed a cup of burnt coffee herself, and stared out at the city that pretended to be asleep. That was when she made the call. Not to PR, not to HR, but to legal. "I want the employment file on Eric Becker," she said, voice steady. "All of it. Performance reviews, background, prior work history, everything we have." The silence on the other end was too long. Finally, someone asked why. She answered simply, "Because no one earns that kind of sun by accident." When the file arrived an hour later, she opened it expecting a few lines. Maybe a note about punctuality. But what she saw made her sit back in her chair. Prior occupation, systems analyst. Technical lead. Hospital safety algorithms. A name she recognized from a project she hadn't thought about in years: the triage software that had once been sold as a miracle and ended up in a Senate hearing after a woman died when the system downgraded her priority code. Her hands went cold. Eric had helped build that, and then he'd vanished. Into janitor's coveralls. Into cleaning at dawn. Into silence. She didn't know whether to admire him or feel sick. Morgan didn't sleep that night. She walked her penthouse in bare feet, thinking of systems that forget people and people who remember systems. The irony wasn't lost on her. She, who had once said in a keynote that optimization starts with data, not emotion, was now being emotionally dismantled by a child who wiped down her desk like it was sacred ground. But what kept her awake wasn't guilt. It was possibility. What if this wasn't just a moment? What if it could be more? She opened her laptop at 3:12 a.m. and drafted an internal memo that she would never send. The subject line read, "Redefining respect," and under it, a single sentence. "The future of this company may not come from the top down, but from the people we stopped seeing." She stared at the cursor blinking at the end of that line for a very long time. The next morning, before the sun had fully unwrapped itself across the skyline, Morgan stood at the window of her office, holding a cup she hadn't yet sipped, eyes fixed on nothing in particular. The building was quiet in a way she hadn't heard in years, no clicking heels, no passive-aggressive laughter in the hallway, just the hush of something bigger beginning to stir. She didn't feel powerful. She felt exposed. And strangely, that was starting to feel like power too. Eric Becker's file was still on her desk, a thin stack of facts about a man who used to design systems to save lives and now pushed carts no one looked at twice. She'd read every word. Twice. She'd Googled him, found nothing beyond an old conference panel and a patent filed 7 years ago with his name buried under 3 co-authors. He had disappeared cleanly, like someone who meant to. And now she knew why. The hospital case in error by the AI he helped build was buried under legalese, but the implication was clear. A woman had died. A system had failed. And Eric had walked away from a world that still printed his logic into every machine it sold. That kind of silence wasn't guilt. It was penance. And suddenly, the way he carried himself, the way his son carried himself made more sense than any resume ever could. She made her way to the service level without telling anyone. No blazer, no heels, just a cardigan and the kind of shoes that didn't echo through tiled corridors. When she pushed the door open, she didn't expect him to be there. But he was, sitting on a flipped bucket, wiping down a mop handle like it was part of something sacred. He didn't look up at first. When he did, it was without surprise. "I figured you'd show up eventually," he said, not unkindly. Morgan stepped in, let the door close behind her. "You didn't tell anyone," she said. He shrugged, didn't see the point. She watched him for a long moment before sitting down across from him, not on a chair, but on the floor. Something she hadn't done in years. "Your son walked into a room full of executives and reminded them what honor looks like," she said, quiet but direct. "That doesn't happen by accident." Eric's jaw flexed. He thinks love means showing up. I never corrected him. Morgan smiled faintly. "Don't." She looked down at her hands, fingers twitching against the cold tile. "Do you regret leaving it all behind?" He didn't answer right away. "Every day? And not at all. You build a system that forgets people long enough, you either become it, or you leave." Later that afternoon, as the upper floors returned to their artificial hum of efficiency, Morgan called an unscheduled meeting with 2 compliance officers and a senior architect from the software division. No titles, no press, no performance metrics. Just one question. What happens when a machine makes a decision no one wants to own? The silence was more honest than anything they'd ever published. She didn't tell them why she was asking. She didn't mention Eric or the file, but she watched their reactions, read the tension behind their polite confusion, the way one of them kept glancing at the clock like he was already late for another meeting about nothing that would matter. She knew then, Eric wasn't just a janitor with a past, he was a resource they'd never known they lost. A voice that had chosen silence because no one had earned the right to hear it again. That night, she didn't draft another memo. She drafted a question, one line in her notes app. What if dignity wasn't a benefit but a system setting? She didn't know yet what that meant. But it stayed with her, long after she closed her laptop and watched the sky turn violet from her window. 3 days later, Noah returned. He wasn't supposed to. Morgan had made sure of that, but he appeared in the lobby after school, holding a crumpled paper in one hand and a chocolate milk in the other. The security guard didn't stop him. He never really did. Morgan was stepping out of the elevator just as Noah reached the top of the stairs. He looked up at her with the kind of proud smile only kids and people who've survived real loss know how to wear. "I got a gold star in reading," he said, unfolding the paper like it was a treaty. Morgan took it, read the handwritten paragraph about planets, and nodded. "I've seen pitch decks that meant less than this," she said. Noah puffed his chest. "My dad says stars only count if you earn them." She crouched to his level and tapped the sticker. "Well, this one shines pretty bright." He looked past her toward the glass wall of her office. "Is my dad working today?" She hesitated. "Yes, but he's not just cleaning." Noah tilted his head. "Then what's he doing?" She smiled, not with her mouth, but with something deeper. "He's being remembered." The first time Eric stood in front of a whiteboard again, he didn't know where to place his hands. It had been years since anyone asked him for insight, let alone invited him into a room with engineers and compliance officers who didn't know what to make of a man in a maintenance uniform holding a dry erase marker. He didn't talk much. He didn't need to. The questions started slow, mostly academic, cautious. as if testing whether he remembered how to speak their language. But then someone, a junior analyst maybe, asked the thing no one else dared to. When did you stop trusting the machine? Eric looked at the whiteboard, then back at them, and answered without pause. The day I realized it could calculate urgency, but not understand it. A quiet fell over the room, not awkward, not performative, just the kind that happens when truth slips past protocol and lands where people weren't ready to receive it. They asked more after that. What he would have done differently, what lines of logic had failed, what safeguards didn't mean what they claimed. And Eric, piece by piece, laid bare the decisions that had once haunted him into silence. He didn't ask for redemption. He just told the truth, slowly, like someone rebuilding a bridge from the inside out. Morgan watched through the glass the whole time, arms folded, heart unexpectedly still. She saw something in Eric's stance, something she hadn't seen in the boardroom in years. Not confidence, not expertise, responsibility, the kind that doesn't need applause to exist. That night, when her assistant asked if they should release Eric's name to the media, maybe use it to frame a new initiative, a human-centered innovation platform, she simply typed back, "No, the story isn't his. It's ours." In a world obsessed with branding everything that breathed, she chose to let this one stay unnamed. Because for the first time, what mattered wasn't the quote or the headline, it was the ripple, the quiet, the shift, the knowledge that maybe, just maybe, real change doesn't happen through rollout decks or LinkedIn posts. It happens when someone who once vanished into the margins is finally asked to speak, and everyone else in the room remembers how to listen. But stories like this don't stay quiet for long, and the world outside had started to buzz in a different register. An article surfaced small at first, buried in a tech blog that prided itself on peeling back the velvet curtain. The headline wasn't subtle. The janitor, the CEO, and the power they pretend isn't there. It was riddled with assumptions, half-truths, anonymous quotes from inside sources who hadn't seen more than 5 seconds of the actual moment. But the damage was immediate. Investors called. The board scheduled a closed-door meeting. Words like objectivity, boundaries, and narrative stability floated to the top of inboxes like oil on water. Morgan saw it coming, of course. She had prepared her whole life for things like this. What she hadn't prepared for was how little she cared about salvaging reputation if it meant selling someone else's dignity to do it. When the board asked for her statement, she didn't send one. When they warned her she might be asked to step aside for the sake of continuity, she replied with a sentence that left them stunned. "Then I'll leave first." Downstairs, Eric had already felt the shift. He was back on his regular route, floors 4 through 8, then restrooms, then the service corridor. People looked at him differently now. Not cruelly, not exactly, but with too much softness or too much space. Like they didn't know whether to congratulate him or avoid him. Someone had scribbled "Mr. Celebrity" on the janitor's breakboard in blue marker. Someone else crossed it out with a line too angry to be playful. Eric ignored it all. He wiped counters, emptied bins, fixed a broken paper towel dispenser with a quiet that came not from resignation, but from peace. And that evening, as he walked out through the side entrance, he found Morgan waiting, not in her car, not in a corner office, but outside, leaning against a concrete pillar like someone who had run out of places to hide from her own evolution. She looked at him and said simply, "If they ask me to pick between protecting the company and protecting what your son reminded me to be, I'll choose the kid every time." Eric didn't smile. He just nodded. And that was enough. The boardroom was full. Not like the usual cold coffee, sterile charts, tired nods, but full in that unsettling, electric way that happens when reputations hang in the air like thunder. Morgan sat at the head of the table, not rattled, not resigned, but completely still. Around her, familiar faces looked unfamiliar now. Some tense, some guilty, a few outright blank. Gregory, the board chair, opened with what was supposed to sound impartial, but landed like a slow accusation. "This isn't personal, Morgan. It's about structure, optics, discipline." But she already knew. They were afraid. Not of what she had done, but of what she had felt. Her refusal to distance herself from someone beneath her had exposed how high their ladder really was, and how much of it they'd built on the backs of people no one ever thanked. When they offered her the chance to walk away quietly, protect her image, frame the fallout as a graceful transition, she stood up without hesitation. And instead of defending herself, She told a room full of executives the one thing none of them could prepare for: the truth. If leadership means pretending the humanity of someone matters less than the press release that follows, then maybe I was never qualified to sit in this chair to begin with. And when she sat down, the room didn't clap. But they didn't vote her out either. By a single vote narrow and laced with discomfort, Morgan Ellis remained CEO. Not because they believed in her, but because they didn't have the courage to admit they needed her more than their fear could tolerate. But that wasn't the end. Not really. Because what followed wasn't a redemption arc. It was a reconstruction. The whispers didn't die down overnight. Articles came and went. Think pieces, backlash, cautious praise. But inside the building, something quieter was happening. The elevators held longer eye contact. Assistants started asking the names of the people who delivered their lunch. Someone removed the executive-only sign from the coffee bar on the top floor and replaced it with one that said, "Welcome in." And somewhere between policy meetings and hallway nods, something new began. It didn't start with Morgan. It started in a disused mailroom, stripped to the studs, fluorescent lights humming like a second chance. That's where Eric stood with her one morning, paint on his hands, a screwdriver in his back pocket, and Max's hand-drawn logo taped to the wall like it was the blueprint for the future. "You really want to do this?" he asked her. She didn't answer with words. She just plugged in the first lamp, sat on the floor beside him, and nodded. And from there, Clearline was born not with venture capital or press launches, but with intent. They built software that didn't assume efficiency meant silence. Interfaces designed by people who cleaned the hallways where other people made decisions. An app that let janitors report maintenance gaps directly to ops. A feedback system that bypassed red tape and let every employee flag when they felt invisible. It wasn't revolutionary in code, but in heart, it was seismic. 6 months later, in a room with no plaques and no hierarchy, Morgan sat beside Eric at a shared table. Around them were coders in hoodies, admin assistants who moonlighted as UX testers, and line cooks on their day off helping test accessibility features. There were no executives, only people. Max was in the corner, tutoring a younger kid on spelling while sipping a juice box with a crooked straw. The old power structure hadn't collapsed, it had simply been bypassed. And no one missed it. Investors came eventually, cautiously. The company didn't scale like wildfire. It grew like roots, steady, below the surface, impossible to shake once it took hold. And when asked by a journalist how it all started, Morgan didn't mention the boardroom, the press, or even the fallout. She simply said, "A little boy cleaned my desk, and I saw myself in the smudge he left behind." That night, at a small kitchen table lit by warm lamps and cluttered with half-burned cookies and unfinished school worksheets, Eric set down a cup of tea and looked at Morgan with a kind of softness that didn't need words. Max had fallen asleep beside them, face pressed against a drawing that read, "My dad is my hero because he never stops showing up." And Morgan, once the coldest person in the highest room, looked at that drawing like it was more valuable than any framed contract she'd ever signed. She reached for Eric's hand. He didn't pull away. And in that moment, they both knew something rare had been built, not from perfection, not from strategy, but from presence. From choosing to stay when silence would have been easier. Outside, the city didn't notice. No sirens, no headlines, just the heartbeat of a world that kept spinning. But inside that room, where 3 people sat in the kind of quiet that only comes after a storm, the truth held its breath and smiled. Because in the end, it wasn't the company that had been saved. It was something older, softer, harder to earn. It was dignity, and the reminder that sometimes the smallest hands leave the cleanest marks.